If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come on. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Oh man, I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation, but that we had with Julie Ponesse, or I should say Dr. Julie Ponesse. But I'm excited for me and you to sort of have our, let's call it the first debrief of an interview. I'm sure, we've done it.
Debrief. I like that, debrief. That's good. Yeah, that's what this is. We're giving some commentary on the last recording we did.
And as the audience can tell, it's called part 1. So if you hear this the day it comes out or the first couple of days it comes out, feel free to give us your feedback and tell us. Well, no, but tell us if you have questions or things you might want us to talk about in part 2. Because,
right, but if they haven't listened to part 1,
oh yeah, obviously
listen to part 1.
Yeah, don't. If you haven't listened to part 1, this conversation might not make so much sense.
Right.
But if you've listened to part 1, you're listening to this conversation, hit us up on social media at sixcentsreport, Twitter, Facebook, sixcentsreport@gmail.com. Tell us, what you want to hear maybe us talk about in part 2, as we're going to continue to dive down the virtue and vaccines or ethics and vaccines rabbit hole.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. Actually, you know what? I think this episode, I gotta double check, but I think this episode is doing pretty good numbers wise.
Oh yeah. No. We're already sort of above the average, and this is like 2 days into.
Oh yeah. Actually, yeah. I'm checking out the numbers, and I'm like, yeah, it's definitely above our average, which is really
basically
good.
In 2 days, it's above the first week average. I should put it. That's the best way of putting it. Normally, by the end of the first week, we're probably just around these numbers, and it's already above that. So
yeah, and I think and like I said before, I think it's definitely a timely episode, and this is something that Joel and I haven't done before, a debrief of an episode, just because of the depth of the content, and we weren't able to go as in depth as we'd like to, just because of time constraints. The episode was like less than an hour.
And hence why there's a part 2.
That's why there's a part 2. Maybe part 3.
Yeah, who knows? We'll see. We'll see how the conversation goes and where we end up, and what do we get through versus what we don't get through.
Yeah. Good. All right. Okay. Good. Okay. So this is a little different vibe. So let's just start with the 2 cents. Joel, what's your 2 cents so far on what you heard from the last episode?
I mean, I'll say my 2 cents might sound a little abstract, but my biggest, I really enjoy the conversation. I really like the way that we're discussing things. And the way that I describe what we do on this show to a lot of people is that I absolutely hate politics, but we want to have conversations about ideas that precede political actions. And I think this is a prime example of deep ideas being discussed and digging into it. And this is the kind of thing that I think in such a, let's call it the pandemic as a societal emergency, this is the kind of conversation that needs to be had as a means to evaluate our particular political actions justified. But we're not having that conversation. So for me, that it's actually just weeding through this topic of, what is good, what is common good. The biggest, there's sort of 2 really big ideas that I thought I asked her the question, but she went down the rabbit hole a little bit of, justifying the harming one person for the benefit of the collective. And I think collectivism versus individualism is such an important topic, as socialism and cultural Marxism and have become so prominent in society again. And then the second, I think she said something I was really, really happy to hear it, because I would say I think this way, but it was profound to hear an ethics professor make this statement, which was, I'm not going to quote her specifically, but this is the way I put it. She found when she was asked to write sort of when could you justify a vaccine mandate, and she said there was no, I started to write it out and I got to the point at the end where there was no scenario where a vaccine mandate could be vaccine mandate
Yeah,
could be justified ethically because the loss of bodily autonomy is too high of a cost.
Okay.
Which essentially comes down to the concept of rights, and owning yourself is the most fundamental property right. If you don't own yourself, no other property right matters. If you don't have bodily autonomy, I would argue no other property right matters. Without going down the rabbit hole, the idea there is that the way that people acquire land rights historically with the idea of homesteading was that they mixed their labor, i.e. themselves, their property, with the land, such that you could no longer segregate, and that's where property rights become derived. Now, obviously, you have the idea of exchanging it later, but the original concept of owning property was, I've mixed my labor with this land, and now it's both me and the land kind of thing. And so I thought really getting into bodily autonomy and the tie into rights, that was my 2 cents, is that these ideas are so important, and they're so highly ignored, or so unknown, or so ignorantly understood by vast majority of society. So what about you? What's your 2 cents? What's your takeaway? What are you maybe excited about that we've started discussing?
Well, before I get into my 2 cents, I just wanted to take a penny away from you. Penny from your thoughts. You hit a good point that really reached out to me as well. The point about not having conversations. And I think that's, from my research on her and checking out her previous content, that's been a speaking point she's always been hitting on. And she said it this way in one of her last interviews. And she said that, the argument, and I guess this is an apologetic here, in regards to giving a defense for why you may not want to get vaccinated. And so she's basically saying that, like, if somebody comes to you and says, okay, Joel, why do you disagree with Dr. Tam? Right? So Dr. Tam is the authority figure. Theresa Tam, Chief Public Health Officer of Canada. So she's studied more than you, Joel. So how can you disagree with the expert, the subject matter expert? Right? Because she's the authority, you're not. She knows more than you. So the conversation's over.
On paper.
But that's not the argument. And that's somewhat of a straw man. So it's not about does Joel know more than Theresa Tam? It's why isn't Theresa Tam having conversations with people that disagree with her?
Yes. And
right?
I think there's 2 parts to that. One is, why aren't we having subject matter experts having conversations with other subject matter experts that disagree? Like, if you wanted to take the appeal to authority, there's a level to that sort of fallacy where there's some truth that experts are going to most likely have a more depth knowledge that will mean that they're more likely to be able to contribute something of substance to the conversation. The problem, I think, with society is that it doesn't mean that a non-subject matter expert can't comprehend enough to ask intelligent questions or to challenge bad or potentially bad ideas held by the subject matter expert.
Right.
If anything, the concept of compartmentalization or specialization, think of it in the sense of, we use this in biblical sense, seeing the forest for the trees, right? If you're the subject matter expert, you could be so deep at the tree level that you miss the forest. And the non-subject matter expert can ask the questions at the forest level potentially better than you, not because they lack because you lack, the ability to see it, but because you're so deep, you haven't taken a step back to look at it at that level.
Yeah, totally. And so that's what I thought, that was a great point, where we're not seeing those conversations at the higher level. And because those conversations are not happening at a higher level, they're not happening at the kitchen table. They're not happening in the car. They're not happening in the church or between friends, because, those people who are above us aren't setting the example of what that discourse looks like. So it's very dismissive, and it polarizes that one person is right, one person is wrong, one person is doing good, one person is doing evil. And so just very simply, we have to get back to a point of having dialogue instead of monologue. Right. And especially as Christians, we know that our strongest weapon in regards to communicating the gospel is dialogue, not monologue. So it's very important that we use our words, we use our definitions, we use grace, we listen before we speak, be slow to speak, and so forth. So this is why I think is one of those points that she constantly hits at, and I think it's a point that could definitely turn the tide if people start trying to practice this principle.
No,
Right?
So the idea of having conversations with people you disagree with is like she said that is something similar. She's like, that is a moral good. I don't, maybe butchering it slightly, but the idea of
that's what
essentially disagreeing people or people presenting a disagreeing idea is a moral good. And this is where, the quotes that I would think people who may be on our side or even just are paying attention to the conversations right now, statements like the people on historically, those who have been censoring, book burning are never on the right side of history. That's, to me, that's the other side or sort of a off the cuff comment version of what she has said. It's the same thing, right? The disagreement and willingness to listen to ideas, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent is not the point, but actually taking in skeptics and listening to their perspectives and either refuting them or engaging with them is the reason why I would say it's a moral good. We can go back to what Nick Hudson said on our podcast months ago now. He had this great line: centralization removes the means for error correction. I.e., when you centralize ideas such that the ministry of truth decides what's true, you have removed the means for error correction. So when the ministry of truth holds a wrong idea, how do we identify that it's wrong when you've essentially censored or silenced, or in the case of, let's say, public officials in Canada, we have not engaged their questions. We've just deemed them as deniers, conspiracy theorists, whatever, slang you want to throw out there so that people will stop listening.
Okay, so for my 2 cents, my takeaway was when she opened up and had a great question, and she said, when do we know when we are succeeding morally? So I thought that was a great question. And then at the end of the show, she says, morality does not require perfection. And I had to kind of sit on that for a bit and kind of like say, morality does not require perfection. And then I was like, actually, no, I think I would disagree with that, humbly disagree with that. And it's funny because in the start of the show, she was like, yeah, we agree, but there's points we probably disagree, and we should continue to disagree and have those conversations. So I was like, okay, so who knows?
And in your mind, you're probably like, nah, we probably agree pretty much on most things.
Yeah, but here's a point where I would give some pushback to her on this, and so the idea that morality does not require perfection, I would disagree, because in order to know something is morally right, morally good, you need a standard. And biblically speaking, that standard is perfection, holiness, which means to be separate,
set apart,
right? Set apart. And so that's how we know we are moving closer to the mark. And being in a secular culture, they remove the standard, you remove the perfection, and and everything becomes relative. And this is why we're in such a hot mess right now. So I think that answers the previous question she had. When do we know when we are succeeding morally? Well, we know we are succeeding morally when we're moving closer to that standard, closer to that perfection. And that standard is something that sits outside of us. I'm not saying, okay, well, I'm a better person than Joel, or I'm trying to do what Joel's doing. But we're saying, okay, well, the ultimate standard, and I mentioned this before in the start, that it is God. God is the ultimate standard of good. And so the idea that God is the ultimate standard of good is which is where all good derives from. Right. So when I think about and I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but the Euthyphro Dilemma. Right. Are you familiar with that,
No,
Joel?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh, okay.
Sound like you
All
said
right.
Afro Dilemma.
No. The Euthyphro, Euthyphro Dilemma. It's something I learned my first year at Tyndale, taking, I think it was apologetics, but the Euthyphro Dilemma, right? And it was something that we all had to learn. And so the idea is that it's from Plato's dialogue. Right. And so Socrates is having a conversation with Euthyphro, and he asks him this dilemma, and he says, does God love good action because it is good? Or is good action good because it is loved by God? Right. I'll say that again. Does God love good action because it is good? Or is good action good because it is loved by God? And so the answer to the question is, well, it's a false dilemma. It's neither. It's neither. Right. Well, this is the Christian answer, right? It's a false dilemma. It's neither. That is, God, the good is God because God is the ultimate good. Right. Good is God because God is the ultimate good. And so the 10 Commandments are not just arbitrary rules God made up, but they derive from God's character. Right. And so this is where we are. So when we apply it, it's if God's law is not overruling government or the world, then some kind of super state must provide that standard. Right. And this is how we know we're hitting the mark and we're moving in the right direction. Now, of course, we all know that, we're a postmodern society. We're moving away from God. And as we moved away from God, we became more relative in our understanding of what's right and wrong. And now, once the pressure's applied.
This past summer, my pastor made a reference that, I think it's the word of the year for 2016 was post-truth.
Post-truth. Okay, all right.
This just cool. Resonates with what you're saying, right? Like the idea we're moving away from objective truth.
Yes.
To relativism.
Yes. Yeah. And I would also throw in there subject matter experts where that's where we're deriving it from. And I love the fact that we opened up with talking about collectivism and that being the moral principle people are working from in regards to knowing what's right or wrong. But I think just to be clear to make sure we have our sections sorted out. So in ethical theory, right, there's 3 types of schools of thought. And it's not too complicated, but it's just overarching categories because I need categories to organize my thoughts. So there's deontological systems. Oh, and sorry, this is from the book it's called Moral Choices: An Introduction to Ethics by Scott B. Ray. And so he talks about deontological systems. And deontological systems are rules, right? They're the rules in which we figure out what's right and wrong. Simple. The teleological systems, teleological meaning end goal or outcome in the Greek, it's basically talking about, utilitarianism, right? Which is seeking the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or as Dr. Ponesse pointed out, was that it's an aggregate good when we look at the utilitarianism. But then also, there's also this other school of thought under the theological system that is egoism, right? Where people would say, okay, well, that's a school of thought saying, okay, well, it's all about individualism. It's all about the individual, right? So you have the collective, which is good for the collective or good for the individual, the ethical egoism. But for the Christian, right, we're saying, well, it's not necessarily either or, right? But we're seeing, what is best or what's more glorifying to God? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. And then the last school of thought is relativism. And we all know what that is. That's where there is no such thing as right or wrong. Everything is relative.
It's largely the majority rule or majority standard almost.
Yeah. Most people, it's relativism, and that's the scary part. But I think it's important to make sure we have these categories, so that we're clear on what direction we're going into. Because when it comes to ethical issues, we want to be able to speak with accuracy.
Mhm.
Especially for Christians, we want to speak with biblical accuracy, because we don't want to get it right to be on the right side of history, right? We want to get it right to glorify God and be helpful to our fellow man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's interesting? So first, there's 2 points I want to make. One is maybe give you the pushback. I'll save this one. I'll come back to it. Give you the pushback that I think she might give you on sort of her question that you're,
Oh, okay. Actually, let me hear that.
Okay. So sorry, what's the statement again? What was her statement again that you started with?
Okay. So when do we know when we are succeeding morally? She said that in the start, and then at the end, she said morality does not require perfection.
Yeah. So I think she would agree with all of the things you said in regards to an objective standard for, let's call it, I'll use the term righteousness instead, just as a point of clarification. I think what she's using, the way she's speaking about morality, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we'll get into this with her a bit. Maybe not.
Keep a straw man free, man. Keep a straw man free.
No. And I think what she would say is, in a pluralistic society, that's where perfection wouldn't apply to morality, because not everybody has the same standard, and so morality has to take into account those that use relative versus those that use objective. Now, as a Christian, we would say righteousness is defined by an objective standard. And so I think she might try to walk the line a little bit with regards to saying, well, I'm not using the word in the way that you're defining it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she's got a slightly different point. But the reason I say that is that I don't think you're necessarily disagreeing with her, because I don't necessarily think she holds the view in the way that you've couched it. And
yeah, you're right. I agree. Yeah, I think you're right, because I don't think she would deny, because she also teaches critical thinking. So in order to be able to use logic and critical thinking, you have to think objectively. So you have to acknowledge that there is a such thing as objective, absolute truth. Right, but it was just a phrase that she mentioned, and she's mentioned it before, I think, in her other talks. Right.
Yeah. So maybe that's a way we can start the interview. Is just get launchpad. Like, what do you mean by that? Why do you say it that way? As opposed to necessarily giving your pushback, but getting her to expound the point. And maybe it'll come up in our part 2 debrief if that's something we decide to do.
Yeah. If it's necessary. Yeah, because I just think it's important that we're hitting that point to make sure that we're clear on our standards, because even Christians, especially if you're not biblically literate and you're not familiar with the text, you believe in the Lord, but you're not familiar with the text, and you just get carried away by every wind of doctrine, and you're not sure what is the good, what is true, right? What is real. So.
Yeah. So the second point I wanted to make was going back to the collectivism and individual, right? Because what's funny is when she started talking about rule utilitarians, right? What she was really
which goes under deontological systems.
Yeah, and what essentially that sort of represents is this idea that we want to do the collective good, and we've come up with these rules to protect the individual. The reason I wanted to go there is that I think those rules essentially represent property rights. Or the concept of rights. The rule utilitarian goes, oh, well, if we recognize this, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but that's not the point, though, because I want to take it somewhere in a second. The rule utilitarians essentially go, okay, here's these individual rights that we need to protect so that we don't allow individual harms because they result in a greater good. The simplest example I can think of is like, oh, let's kill this one person, steal all of their organs, and we can save 8 people. Like, someone could argue that's for the greater good, but the rights having the concept of rights is what prevents the rule utilitarian from saying, yep, that person qualifies, we're just going to kill them and take their organs. So the reason I want to go there is to go, well, the individual route, right? Like, what is why do people go away from individualism and go towards collectivism? Well, I would think for the most part, it's this idea that, if everyone's self-serving, they're just going to, take the raid versus trade. They're just going to steal from everyone else. They're going to no respect for each other. You're just going to end up with mob rule, right? This is sort of the argument against whether it be an anarchist or a hardcore free market view or whatever the sort of very, very different, whether even laissez-faire, right? There would be this argument that, the harms are going to happen. And this is where, the free market economist perspective is that it is the concept of rights that results in when a right is violated, restitution is necessary that prevents such a thing. And what's funny is you're essentially seeing these collectivist ideologies going, well, we need to protect the individual. And what I'm saying is that the way that I really focus on let everybody work out what is perfect in their own scenario, they're going to be forced to respect other people's rights because of individualism. And individualism will then result in when I need to do something that's going to be a slight harm to you, let's say, something not so, I want to build something on my land, and in order to make it fit, I need to, move the property line by like a foot. Well, the way I do that is by compensating my neighbor and saying, hey, can we move the property line? Can I buy an extra foot off you? Here, is this enough money? Is this enough money? And I'm going to cause him harm because he's going to lose some property, but I'm going to compensate him for that harm.
Okay, so are you saying that you're rule utilitarian?
No, I'm saying that the rule utilitarian is essentially identifying the things that make the free market hardcore positions, why the free market hardcore position is argued. The things that they're trying to...
Sorry, what? Say that a different way, man.
The things they're trying to adopt to prevent individual harms are the fundamental basis for why the free market position is argued as going to be the best outcome.
Okay, so are you rule utilitarian?
No, I would say I'm not utilitarian in any sense. What I'm saying is that so come back around. They're looking at it for the greatest good. And I'm saying the actual individualistic perspective, by protecting individual rights, by limiting the ability for the collective to harm the individual, and basically the only time you can do harm to the individual is when you're causing restitution for the harms the individual has already caused. When you're doing that, that will result in the greatest good. So I'm actually saying that the things that they recognize as, we need to respect these individual things so that we don't infringe too much, so that we can achieve the greatest good, is actually by trying to do the collectivist things. If you weren't trying to do them, but you left the individuals to their freedom, that they would result in the greatest good. And the reason why I want to bring it up is like, it's somewhat ironic that the basis for the individualistic free market arguments is the thing the rule utilitarians look to go, well, we need to take these things to make sure we don't cause harm. So I'm hopefully my point isn't being lost, that what I'm trying to say is that it's the irony of the scenario of those hyper collectivists that go, we need to recognize X, Y, and Z things. And those are actually the basis of the free market position that would argue you're going to result in a greater prosperity. And so when I say greater prosperity, just let me contextualize it. What I would say by that is the lowest levels of society are going to have higher standards of living than they do under the scenario where the collectivist tries to raise up the lowest levels. I'm not saying there will be less inequality. No, because I don't think that's a proper standard. It's, to me, when I make all my free market arguments, when I make all my individual rights arguments, the purpose or the objective, or sorry, what I would argue the result is going to be is that the lowest levels of society will be better off, i.e. will have less percentage of people in poverty. Like, I mean, the Bible always says there's always going to be the poor. There's always going to be whether it be the sick, the orphan, there's always going to be people within society that are that have been harmed or need help or need charity. The question becomes, how do we minimize that? And I think too much of the collectivist view tries to stamp it out and pretend like, well, they have this utopian way of like, we can make it all go away.
Right, because I guess looking at the utilitarian view, right, which is teleological in the sense that it's looking at, okay, well, what is the good? Is it good for the collective, or is it the good for the individual? And part of it is, and that's why I was making that point that, okay, well, we can't define the good by what the individual wants or what the collective wants. And so there's an essay, 1958 essay by British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe. And she argued that without a concept of a divine lawgiver, it is difficult or perhaps impossible to give an explanation of why something is morally right or wrong. And so the idea is that, again, it comes back to what is the good and making sure that we're hitting the right point. So someone might argue that, and she says, or this is actually from Wayne Grudem's book, Christian Ethics, An Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. And he says, someone might argue that it's right to do an action that brings about good results. But how can we define what a good result is? Someone might suggest that a good result is one that increases happiness for us or other people, or that brings about the greatest amount of happiness for people. But that does not really solve the problem. What gives us the basis for saying that it is good to bring about happiness, right? Just because people like to be happy does not provide a convincing answer for why happiness ought to be or why it is a morally good thing. Many people say they like things that other people would say are morally evil. How can we find something outside of ourselves that will provide a final answer to the question of why something ought to be? And this is why we need to come back to the scriptures, especially as Christians, and when we're having these conversations about vaccines and COVID, that we're having our conversations that aren't just puppeting speaking points from the right or left, but we're using text from the scripture and appealing to the conscience of the Christian, and also drawing out the logical conclusion of unbelievers in their moral authority. Because if they don't have a standard, this is where you got them cornered, and you can push them to their logical conclusion with their moral theory and say, okay, well,
based on what?
Yeah, based on what? Yeah, like, and that's why I said it in the last episode. That's why I said, like, yeah, like at one point, enslaving black people was cool. Lynching black people was a good thing, right? The
because
Holocaust was a good thing.
Deemed it so.
This is it, right? Right. So in a sense, we're no different, right? We're no different than what they were doing in the past. If you don't have an objective moral standard, if there is a divine moral law, there must be a divine moral lawgiver.
Well, and I think for me, what I was sort of making the case about individualism and things like that, the part that gets lost in the, use the example I gave with like, the one person being killed for their organs to save 8 people, right? The problem in that context is that it goes back to what I said was the big takeaway that I took away from what Julie had said, right? There's no scenario where the vaccine mandate is justified because the loss of bodily autonomy is too costly. The significance of that is that, or why that ties back in, is the concept, adding the concept of time, right? Like the utilitarian would make the judgment on a time horizon of immediately. In the immediate, that looks to reap the most benefit for the collective. The rule utilitarian starts to go, well, over time, this loss of bodily autonomy is too costly. And so, I always say when I make the arguments about what's good or what's going to result in the greatest good, or, from a societal, not so much the Christian good standard, what is going to result in the most prosperity is probably a better way of putting it. I use the economic principles because we need to look on the long run scale. We don't just look at the individual scenario, what's going to result in the greatest prosperity. No, over 30 years, if we continue in this trajectory, how will incentives change? How will things change such that the consequences, or as we mentioned on the show, I really loved this point too that you had made. We can test the logical, or we can test the consequences of these moral ideas, and that's where adding the time horizon is so important. And I would suggest that, good example, the current discourse today. There's no concept of, if we do this today to solve this problem, i.e., we want to put in this mandate to resolve this problem with COVID. What are the long-term consequences of mandates like this being permitted in society?
Mm-hmm.
Right, that conversation is not being had because we're just ignoring the time horizon concept. We're ignoring all of these things because we need to solve this immediate problem and by any means necessary.
All right, brother Malcolm.
I didn't even mean to do that. That's jokes.
Yeah. So guys, let us know what you guys think of this past episode and this episode. And are there any questions you wanted us to ask, or speaking points?
And if you think this is an important conversation, or the conversation with Julie's, share the episode, send it to people. I would say to you,
real. Man.
Probably sending it in a personal message is probably the best way you can, help out the show. Think of normal business. What's the best way? Word of mouth, right? So,
good news travels fast.
Yeah, exactly. So share the episodes. We always try to do a really good job with show notes page, telling your friends. They can always find it by Googling or searching. Forget Google. Searching in any podcast app, the Six Cents Report, or sixcentsreport.com. So, share, hook us up. We appreciate it.
And also check out the YouTube page. We're on YouTube, and we actually have a playlist of the best speaking points from our past conversations. So check it out. So sometimes I know not everybody has time to sit down through a whole episode, but there are 5-minute, 2-minute, 3-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute snippets that you can the specific thing that you're looking for, and then you get a bite-sized taste of the Six Cents Report.
Yeah, and not every episode's like that, but obviously, if you like that, if you think we should be doing more of that, maybe give us a shout out that you want to help us out and contribute some time, because we could always use some extra hands on deck.
Hands on deck.
If you think we need more of those short videos. So
yeah. So please contact us. Let us know if you're trying to get in touch with me. Do good at Darnell on Instagram and Twitter. That's DOGUDDA_Darnell. Darnell Samuels on Facebook.
And I'm TJoelN39 everywhere.
6 cents makes change, baby.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?
Madden and Mitchell Media.